So, good evening, everyone. Buonasera. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. And first of all, yes, I'd like to say that, well, congratulations on this exhibition. And I knew it was going to be beautiful because it's Carmen's exhibition. And I've had the privilege and the pleasure of working with Carmen for many years. And she taught me so much. I'm getting a little emotional. And she was a curator for years and years at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And she really has just this extraordinary eye for placing work, for placing sculpture in the Guggenheim, which is this very particular building, as many of you might know, this rotunda, not always easy to install, but very exciting place to work in. Exciting for artists, exciting for curators, exciting also for the art handlers. So anyway, first of all, congratulations to you, Carmen, for a really beautiful show. And we were so glad to be able to collaborate and to lend works from the Peggy Guggenheim collection and from the Guggenheim in New York. And in fact, the Guggenheim overall has had a special privileged connection to Alexander Calder. So first of all, Peggy Guggenheim loved sculpture. The first work of art that she ever acquired was a small work by Jean Arp. Sculpture, she bought it directly from Arp from his studio in Paris around 1938, when she was opening her gallery in London, Guggenheim Jeune. And when she went to Arp's studio to select a work for an exhibition of contemporary sculpture that she wanted to organize, she just fell in love with this work, this small two-piece work, polished bronze. It's called Head and Shell. And she just thought she simply had to have it. When she held it in her hand, she thought it was the most beautiful and sensual thing that she'd ever beholden. So that is how the collection starts. And sculpture would eventually become a constant in her life. I mean, a third of Peggy Guggenheim's collection is devoted to sculpture. So, of course, Alexander Calder. And, well, let's talk about that particular work. Which is usually in the Peggy Guggenheim collection. We've missed it a lot, but we're very happy that it's here, of course. Here it is. Can we stop that image for a moment, maybe? Well, here you see Peggy Guggenheim installing it at the 1948 Biennale in Venice, in the Greek pavilion that she had been given to show her collection because Greece was at civil war. And so this pavilion was empty. And Peggy was delighted to be able to show her collection for the first time in a public way. So just to go back in history just a little bit, 1938, she starts to collect in London, even though she wasn't from London, she wasn't European born, she was born in America. Then she goes to Europe very quickly. Then in 1938, she opens her gallery. And then in 1939, when the war breaks out, she returns to Paris, where she'd spent a lot of time beforehand, and she starts collecting a painting a day, as she famously writes in her autobiography. Then she returns to New York in 1941, opens her gallery Art of His Century, and by this time she knew Calder, who'd also spent time in Paris, as Tobia mentioned. Her gallery is very successful from an artistic point of view. It had been designed by the visionary architect and designer Frederick Kiesler. And this gallery is also where Peggy launched many of the young American abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock and many others. But by 1947, Peggy was fed up with the gallery. She really was longing to go back to Europe, and she'd always wanted to go back, she'd wanted to live there, and she also had wanted to live in Venice. She'd known Venice ever since she was a very young girl, when her father, Benjamin, who died on the Titanic in 1912, had taken her there as a little girl, and then she'd gone back to Venice as a young bride with her first husband, Lawrence Vail, who was a French-American writer and artist. So she wants to go back to Venice, and in the meantime, she'd been invited, as I was saying, to show her collection in the Greek pavilion. This was an amazing moment for Peggy, because as I was saying, by now she'd assembled the bulk, the backbone of her collection, the artists that she'd been acquiring, in Paris at the beginning of a war, and then also all the works that she'd collected by the young American artists. So you can imagine that after the very painful and traumatic years of World War II in Venice, in Europe, having Peggy Guggenheim arrive with her collection was something really quite extraordinary. Overall, it was a huge hit. Some people didn't like it at all. They thought it was too modern, too contemporary, too shocking. But it was the first Biennale in years since the conflict. And Peggy, I think, with her collection, brought a breath of fresh air to Italy and certainly to Venice. And many artists thought that she was in fact going to bring a lot more to Venice. And in fact she did, because when she opened her palazzo, which she acquired in 1949, she was able to finally place her extraordinary collection, including her sculptures by Calder and others, and then open up the collection to the public for the next 30 years until her death. But to go back to Calder, so there in that picture, you see her placing the sculpture that we have in the galleries. She was extremely fond of this sculpture. And she was very fond of Calder, even though they didn't know each other extremely well. But there are a couple of nice stories to say about that. But maybe I've talked too much, and I can go on talking afterwards. And you go. It's okay.
I didn't know what you are telling.
All right. Okay. So yes, a couple of anecdotes. So when Peggy opens her museum gallery, Art of this Century, in October 1942. She decides, well, she wants to show her impartiality between abstraction and surrealism. In fact, it was Marcel Duchamp who had taught her a lot about modern contemporary art. And he was the one who famously taught her what was the difference between abstract art and surrealist art. And you may know that, in fact, the Peggy Guggenheim collection is very rich in the holdings of surrealist art and abstract art. So on the night of the opening, on the 20th of October, 1942, Peggy wears a mini mobile in bronze by Calder in one ear, and in the other ear she wears a miniature landscape by the marvelous French artist Yves Tanguy to show her impartiality between both movements. And then there's a very funny anecdote which Peggy writes about in her autobiography. In the 1940s, when she's back in New York City, at some party, either at her house or somebody else's, she comes, she sees Calder. Say, oh, hi, Sandy, how are you? How's my bed coming along? Sandy's wife is a little shocked. What's this between Peggy and Sandy? Peggy reassured her. Maybe Calder wasn't her type, I don't know. But Peggy had commissioned Calder to design and make a bed piece for her head, that famous silver piece, which is now permanently in the museum, and which is this marvelous three-dimensional sculpture that Calder made himself, of course, beaten silver with most marvelous elements, including a dragonfly, fish, flowers, and an object, I think, which really is perfect for Venice. It really seems to float in the bedroom and is this wonderful combination of flora and fauna within the piece. So those are two lovely anecdotes about Calder. And Peggy bought other works by Calder. Right now, in fact, we took the opportunity to hang a small piece which he made around 1934, and which is composed of small pieces of glass and found bits of ceramics. It's quite rough in some ways, but it's really quite lovely, very delicate. And as I was saying earlier to Carmen, I've always been amazed that this big, burly man could make such extraordinary, delicate sculpture, because you hardly expect it. But he was obviously this brilliant artist, somebody who could work with his hands so well, so efficiently, and really produce some amazing work. Now, the Guggenheim Museum also has some extraordinary Calders which are in the exhibition. And that is thanks in part to two other extraordinary women. One of them is Hilary Bay, who was the founding director and advisor to Solomon Guggenheim. And she advised him when the Guggenheim wasn't yet known as the Guggenheim Museum, but was the Museum of Non-Objective Painting on East 54th Street, just a few blocks away from Art of his Century. And also thanks to Catherine Dreyer, who was this other extraordinary woman who had founded the Société Anonyme with Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp around 1921, 1922. And the Guggenheim Foundation was extremely lucky to benefit both from Hilary Bay's personal collection, which included Calder, and also Catherine Dreyer, who was a great admirer of Calder. So the Guggenheim Foundation is really very wealthy in that respect, very rich in these sculptures. And there's also another splendid sculpture, but a very late sculpture, a stabile, a red stabile, which belongs to the Schulhoff collection and which lives at the Guggenheim in Venice.
When you have those beautiful stabile, which we would have loved to have, but it was too complicated.
It was too complicated. And then you would have made me very sad, Carmen, because you would have taken everything away, but then it would have been here, which would have been fantastic as well.
Yes, we see Peggy was still allowed and able to handle those things
herself. I know.
We would not go near.
No, not even I can touch anything. If I touch something, immediately I'm told off. But yes, how wonderful to be able to touch the sculptures, because the sculptures, even here, I'm sure you've had visitors who wanted to touch them, and some of them are also sculptures which need to be moved. So, yeah.